In the late autumn of 1887, in the high, dry country of central Wyoming Territory, the town of Caswell owned one piece of infrastructure it did not fully understand and could not afford to lose. The water tower stood at the north end of Main Street, 62 feet of riveted iron and Douglas fir framing, its tank sealed against the sky like a dark bell inverted over the town. It had been built in 1871 by a civil works contractor named Doyle under a county infrastructure bond, and it had served Caswell's households and its one hotel and its livery barn through 16 years of hard winters. For as long as anyone in town could reliably remember, it groaned in the night, not loudly. It was a low sound, more felt in the chest than heard through the walls, a long metallic complaint that rose sometime after midnight and subsided before first light. The men who had worked the tower over the years said it was settling. They said old iron always talked in the cold. They said a body got used to it. Vera Lund arrived in Caswell on the 4th of October with $41, a canvas grip, and her father's pipe wrench tucked along the side of that grip, where it rode against her hip with every step. She was 26 years old. Her father, Eric Lund, had been a millwright and hydraulic engineer out of Kearney, Nebraska, who had spent 30 years laying water systems for agricultural cooperatives and small municipalities across the plains, and who had died the previous winter of a lung complaint that no amount of skill could repair. Vera had nursed him through his last months in that rented room and had listened to everything he said, because Eric Lund spoke in his illness the way he always had, precisely and without waste, and what he said was worth hearing. She had come to Caswell because the town had advertised in 2 Nebraska papers for someone to take the tower maintenance contract off their hands. The tower's most recent keeper had quit in September, citing the groan and citing what he called the general unpleasantness of the structure. The town board offered the contract at a fee of $18 a month, which covered inspections, minor repairs, valve monitoring, and general upkeep. It was not a generous wage. The town had sweetened it with occupancy of the tower keeper's shed, a low-roof building of clapboard and tar paper that stood at the base of the tower's northwest leg, containing a wood stove, a rope cot, and a single window that faced the street. 3 men had bid on the contract before Vera's letter arrived, and all 3 had walked away once they stood beneath the tower in the dark and heard the sound it made. The board accepted Vera's bid without enthusiasm and with a candor she appreciated. She was told directly that the structure was aging and that the town had not the funds to replace it, and that the previous 3 keepers had lasted less than 6 months combined. She was also told by the board's chairman, a dry goods merchant named Pell, that a young woman keeping a water tower was an unusual arrangement, and that he hoped she understood the work was not gentle. Vera told him she understood the work. She did not elaborate. The wrench had a crack in its upper jaw that her father had repaired with a leather wrap, binding it tight with a waxed cord so the grip held. Eric Lund had carried it for 20 years before her. She set it on the windowsill of the keeper's shed her first evening and looked at it there in the lamplight, its iron surface dark with decades of pipe oil and handled wear. And she thought of what he used to say when she was a girl and would follow him out to watch him work a new installation. He would crouch at a valve junction and run his fingers along the pipe and say, "Every system tells you what it is doing if you know how to listen. The sound is the system talking." She had been 12 years old when she first understood that this was not a metaphor. She heard the groan for the first time that same night. It began around midnight, a low vibration that came up through the floorboards of the shed and settled somewhere behind her sternum. She lay still on the rope cot and listened to it with her eyes open in the dark. It rose in pitch, held a moment, and then descended again. It repeated the cycle twice more before she sat up and pulled on her coat. She stood outside in the October cold and looked up at the tower. The tank was a black shape against a scattered field of stars. The sound was coming from the structure, yes, but not evenly. It was concentrated, she thought, somewhere near the top. Near the drum, every water tower of this pattern had a maintenance drum, a cylindrical access chamber at the top of the tank, where the inlet pipe, the overflow pipe, and the float mechanism could be reached from inside without draining the tank. The drum was accessed through an exterior hatch on the tank's upper curve, reached by a service ladder that ran up the exterior of the main supports. Vera had noted the ladder that afternoon. Its lower rungs were badly rusted, 2 of them missing entirely, and the hatch at the top was secured with a hasp and a padlock, whose key the board's secretary had pressed into her hand with the warning that no one had opened it in at least 4 years. She did not climb that night. She went back inside and lay down and listened to the groan complete its cycle and subside. She listened to it the way her father had taught her to listen to a system. Not for what it frightened her into feeling, but for what it was describing. It was describing pressure equalization. A water tower holds a head of pressure that distributes through the outlet pipes by gravity. At night, when the town's draw drops to near zero, that pressure has nowhere to go. In a well-sealed system, the pressure simply holds, stable, quiet. In a system with a secondary outlet, something drawing water through a pipe the tower's primary controls did not govern, the pressure would seek its own level through that secondary path. The movement of water through a secondary pipe created friction, vibration. At sufficient volume and frequency, that vibration would travel up through the tower's iron into the framing members and into the tank, and an old tank with imperfect seams would translate that vibration into sound. A low, cycling groan. Vera lay in the dark and thought about this with the calm her father had also taught her. She did not reach a conclusion that night. A conclusion required evidence. What she had was a hypothesis, and a hypothesis required work. She began the next morning with the exterior. She walked the base of the tower's 4 support legs and noted the pipe runs she could trace at grade. The main inlet from the town's artesian well, the primary outlet that fed the distribution main on Main Street, and the overflow that discharged into a stone-lined sump on the structure's east side. 3 pipes, all properly documented in the thin sheaf of maintenance records the board had given her. 3 pipes accounted for. She crouched at each pipe junction and pressed her fingers to the iron at the collar where it entered the earth, feeling for vibration the way her father had taught her to feel for it. The pad of the middle finger laid flat against the metal and held there until the ambient tremor of the morning, a cart on the street, the stamp of a horse at the livery, subsided and she could read the subtler movement below. The inlet pipe was still. The outlet pipe was still. The overflow pipe was still at the collar but carried a faint tick 30 inches along its run, a periodic tap she identified as a check valve, seating and releasing with each small fluctuation in the town's morning draw. Normal. Expected. She noted it anyway with the time and a brief description in the ledger. She found the 4th by following a slight depression in the soil along the north leg of the tower, a narrow trench that had been backfilled but that had settled unevenly over the years, leaving a ripple in the ground that the autumn grass did not entirely conceal. She first noticed it while cutting southeast from the overflow sump, following the tower's foundation perimeter by eye. The grass along the north leg stood a half-inch shorter than the grass beside it, which was what ground does over a filled trench when the fill does not compress to the same density as the surrounding soil, and the shallow roots of the grass draw unevenly. She had seen her father find buried pipe by the same method in fields outside of Kearney, where the farmers had forgotten their own irrigation runs after a wet decade had made the buried work irrelevant. She paced the depression north, away from the tower for 30 yards before it passed under a wooden fence, and into the alley behind the harness shop. She lost it there in the packed earth of the alley floor. She noted the direction in the small ledger she kept in her coat pocket. With a pencil her father had given her, and she went back to the tower. She spent 2 days on the ladder. The lower section required the most work. She brought timber from the lumber yard, cut new rungs, and drove them into the existing rail with the adze end of a hatchet borrowed from the livery. She replaced the worst of the rusted treads with iron stock from the hardware, boring new holes through the rail and pinning them with bolts she tapped herself. The hardware merchant watched her work from his doorway with an expression she had seen on other men's faces before, the look of a person revising an estimate they had made too quickly, and said nothing until she had finished, at which point he said only that the old rungs had been that way since before he'd arrived in town, and nobody had thought to do anything about it. He spoke of it as if it were a fact of nature. She thanked him for the use of his tap and die set, and carried them back. Working a ladder in that state was not a matter of courage. Her father had taught her that heights were the same as any other problem in ironwork. You gave each point of contact your full attention, and you did not skip a step. The critical rule was the 3-point rule: both hands and 1 foot, or both feet and 1 hand, in contact with the structure at every moment. She climbed to the 30th rung before she found the second section where the rail itself had pitted. Not just the rungs, but the vertical iron of the rail, eaten at by 15 years of wet snow and salt wind, until it had the texture of old bread. She came back down and spent that afternoon grinding and treating the pitted sections with a red oxide primer she mixed from the powder she kept in the grip, and let it cure overnight before she tested her weight against it at the 30th rung and found it solid. The upper half of the ladder was in better condition, the framing somewhat protected by its proximity to the tank's wide body. On the second afternoon, she climbed all the way to the hatch and back twice, testing every rung in sequence before she was satisfied. By the end of the second day, the ladder was sound to the top. She had not yet opened the hatch. She wanted to know more about the ground-level pipe configuration before she went inside. That evening, she sat in the keeper's shed with the maintenance records spread on the small table and worked through the original installation drawings. They were dated 1871 and bore a surveyor's stamp and Doyle's signature, bold and confident in the lower right corner. She had heard Doyle's name from the board chairman and from the hardware merchant, who had mentioned him as a member of the Waterworks Board. She had not yet placed a face to the name. The drawings showed 3 pipes, as the records described. 3 pipes, properly engineered for the tower's stated capacity and the town's projected draw. She found the discrepancy in the material schedule. The schedule listed 4 flanged couplings of 3-inch diameter at the tank base, but the drawings showed connections for only 3. 1 coupling unaccounted for. Flanged couplings of that size did not appear in a water system without a pipe attached to them. If a coupling was installed and no pipe was shown in the drawings, either the drawings had been altered after construction, or a pipe had been added after the drawings were filed, and the addition had not been recorded. She thought about the trench she had followed north of the tower, the slight depression under the fence, the direction of the alley behind the harness shop. She thought about the downstream homesteaders cooperative she had read a line about in the county water records before leaving Nebraska, a rural association that had subscribed to Caswell's tower distribution in 1872, and that had reportedly dissolved in 1878 when the promised distribution water never reached their fields. The county record had not explained why the water had not reached them. The county record had described it only as a failed enterprise. She wrote the word cooperative in her ledger with a line beneath it and a question mark. If you know how to listen, her father had said, she was listening. On the 3rd morning, she asked the board's secretary, a quiet man named Ferris, whether any representative of the old cooperative remained in the area. Ferris thought for a long moment and said there was a woman, a Ruth Calloway, who had dry farmed a plot south of town for the past 20 years on ground that had originally been part of the cooperative's claim. He said Mrs. Calloway was not well liked by the Waterworks Board because she had sent letters to the county office twice in 20 years asserting that the cooperative had been defrauded. The letters had been reviewed and dismissed both times for lack of physical evidence. Vera walked out to Ruth Calloway's place that afternoon. It was a mile and a half south on a rutted track, past the last of the town's outbuildings, and into a stretch of country where the grass had been grazed nearly to bare soil, and the October light came flat and cold across everything. The farmstead was small, a sod house with a low doorway, and a leaning outbuilding whose roof had been patched with flattened tin, with a kitchen garden put to bed for the season, and a well that Vera could see from the track had been drilled by hand to an impressive depth, probably 50 feet or more given the dryness of the surrounding soil. Whoever had dug it had put serious work into it. The garden's irrigation ditches were narrow and well cut, the soil between them still dark with the season's last watering. She had done this alone, or near to alone, for a very long time. Ruth Calloway was 73 years old and dry as the country she had farmed for 2 decades. She came to the door of the sod house and looked at Vera without speaking, and Vera told her who she was and what her father had done for a living and what she had found so far. She told it plain without editorializing: the depression in the soil, the missing coupling in the material schedule, the way the groan sounded in the middle of the night, and what it described to anyone who knew how a pressurized system behaved. Ruth listened to all of it without moving from the doorway. When Vera finished, Ruth said in a voice like weathered board that she had been telling anyone who would listen for 22 years that Doyle had stolen the water, that the 3-inch lateral he had added to the tower base the winter after construction had run north to a trough connection that fed a private ditch serving 3 commercial orchards in which Doyle held a quiet interest, and that the cooperative families had paid their subscription dues for 6 years while their fields drew nothing and their wells silted, and 4 children died in the hot summer of 1876 when the drinking water ran short. She said, "We thought it was our fault the first 2 years. We thought we had dug too shallow, or tapped the wrong soil, or laid our own distribution runs at the wrong grade. My husband pulled up our entire secondary line and relayed it in 1874, and it still ran dry." She said this without particular emotion, the flat recounting of a decision made in error for reasons that were not errors at the time. She said she had never had a document. She said Doyle had seen to that. The original installation records, the working drawings, the as-built survey, all of it had been in the county water office. And in 1879, a fire in the county clerk's annex had destroyed the water office's filing room. The town of Caswell's original tower records had burned. What remained was Doyle's own set of drawings, which were the filed set, the ones with 3 pipes. Vera said she thought there might be a second set of drawings inside the tower's drum. Ruth Calloway looked at her for a long, still moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "You had better come in." They sat at Ruth's table for 2 hours. Vera learned the full shape of the cooperative. 11 families, 48 people, 230 acres of land between them. She learned that 6 of those families had sold out and left by 1879, and that the remaining 5 had stayed and dry farmed what they could, and that by 1885, only Ruth remained on original cooperative land, the rest having sold under duress to buyers Vera thought she could identify from the county tax rolls if she needed to. She learned that Ruth had sent her first letter to the county water office in 1880 and her second in 1896, and that both had been answered with a form letter citing the absence of physical evidence. If there were documents in the drum, Ruth said, they would be in whatever Doyle had sealed up there when he finished the installation. She said he had come back to the tower in the spring of 1872, alone, and spent 2 days at the top on work he described to the board as float mechanism adjustment. The tower keeper at that time had been a man named Sutter, who had died in 1879, and whatever Sutter had known about those 2 days had gone with him. Vera walked back to town in the long autumn light, the wrench in her grip, and she thought about a man who spent 2 days at the top of a tower alone, doing work that was not float mechanism adjustment. A man who knew that the groan the tower made in the night was not settling and not old iron talking, but was the sound of a system doing exactly what he had designed it to do. She thought about documents sealed inside a drum for 15 years, in a space where temperature and moisture fluctuated with every season. Paper at risk. She did not let herself run ahead of what she had not yet found. She began her ascent of the ladder before dawn on the 5th day. She had waited for a dry morning and still air, which arrived together on the 5th day after a night that had been heavy with cloud and a faint smell of distant snow. She rose at 4:30 and lit the lantern and dressed and checked the items she had assembled on the table the night before: the padlock key on its cord, the pipe wrench on a leather loop, the pry bar, the candle lantern with a full reservoir, the tin of petroleum jelly, and a length of light rope for lowering the lantern ahead of her into the drum. She ate nothing that morning, which was her habit before work that required balance and precision. She started up the ladder as the sky began its first gray shift. By the time she reached the 30th rung, the eastern horizon had gone from black to a deep orange-red at its narrowest line, the color of the oxide paint on the tower's riveted iron. She kept her eyes on the rungs and counted them as her father had taught her, so that she could account for her position on the structure at any point, without looking down. She reached the top as the sun cleared the horizon. The air at the top of the tower was colder than the air at the ground by 10 degrees, and the wind had a particular quality at 60 feet in Wyoming in October, thin and insistent, moving without announcement. Vera wore her coat and her father's work gloves, and she carried the padlock key on a cord around her neck and the pipe wrench on a loop at her belt. The hatch was a round iron door 18 inches across, set flush into the upper curve of the tank. The padlock was a heavy lever-type lock with a brass face that had greened in the weather to a pale salt blue. The key turned with effort after she worked the shackle with a drop of oil, and the padlock opened with a sound like a small bone breaking. The hatch itself resisted. 4 years of Wyoming weather had worked the hinges into something near fused iron, the pin sheaths swollen with alternating freeze and thaw, until the gap between pin and sheath had been reduced to nothing. She applied the petroleum jelly into each hinge socket with a probe of wire, packed it in and let it sit for 10 minutes in the morning cold. And then she applied the pipe wrench to the hinge pin of the upper bracket and worked it, not with force but with patience, her weight leaning into each small rotation, her father's voice in her memory saying that a forced joint breaks and a worked joint opens. She was there for an hour before the upper hinge freed. The lower followed in 20 minutes. The drum below the hatch was dry. This was the first thing she noticed. Dry where, by any fair reasoning, the drum should have shown moisture from the tank's working surface. A dry drum meant the tank's interior seal at the drum base was intact, which meant the drum had been functioning as a closed space rather than an open access chamber. Its contents, if any, had been preserved against weather from above and against moisture from below. She lowered the lantern on its cord first and let her eyes adjust before she descended. The drum was 6 feet deep and 4 feet across, its iron walls sweating only slightly with ambient cold. The air inside was cold and still, and carried the faint mineral smell of old iron and something else below it, something like old paper and linseed, the smell of a sealed space that had not moved in years. She descended with both hands on the drum's interior ladder, a short fixed section of iron rungs, and planted her feet on the drum floor and stood still for a moment in the lamplight. She turned a slow circle. The float mechanism was directly overhead, its rod running through the center of the drum to the float body suspended in the tank above, its pivot mechanism visible through a mesh screen at the drum ceiling, exactly as the drawings described. The inlet coupling was at the 10 o'clock position on the drum wall, properly valved and sealed. The overflow standpipe was at the 2 o'clock position. These two she had expected. At the 8 o'clock position, low on the curved wall, below the line that the file drawings had defined as the working floor of the drum, there was a third pipe coupling. She crouched and brought the lantern close. The coupling was flanged, 3 inches in diameter, its bolts torqued tight and the joint sealed with a compound she recognized as white lead and linseed putty, which was the standard pipe joint sealer of the early 1870s and which had hardened over 15 years to the consistency of chalky stone. The pipe ran from the coupling into the drum wall and disappeared through the iron. At the coupling's inboard end, where the pipe entered the drum's interior, an inline valve had been fitted, cast iron, 4 inches across at the body, with a handle that had been wired in the open position. The wire was copper, heavy gauge, and the ends of it were sealed with a compression of lead that bore a small stamped impression. At the bottom of the drum's curved wall, bolted flush against the iron in a position that would have been invisible from the open hatch above and invisible from the float mechanism access port, was a tin document case, a concealed valve, cast iron, 4 inches in diameter, with a handle that had been wired in the open position, and then the wire secured with a lead seal of the type used on bonded freight. The lead seal bore an impression she did not immediately recognize, but would later identify as the private mark of Doyle's civil works firm. The valve was in line with a pipe that entered the drum through the tank base, below the float mechanism, and exited through the drum wall on the north side, the direction she had paced from the tower into the alley behind the harness shop. Beside the valve, folded inside a tin document case that had been bolted to the drum wall at the same time as the mount, she found 3 items: a set of as-built drawings for the tower that differed from the file drawings in one significant particular. The 4th pipe clearly shown, labeled in Doyle's handwriting as irrigation lateral, private, running north from the drum to a distribution junction outside the tower's property boundary. A signed order for the addition of the lateral dated February 1872, carrying Doyle's signature as contractor, and a second signature she did not recognize that she would later determine belonged to a county engineer who had died in 1881. And a handwritten ledger covering 6 years of flow records for the lateral, showing the volume diverted each season, and in a column headed Receipts, a series of payments to a landholding company, whose principal, the county recorder's records would confirm, was Doyle himself. She sat in the drum for a long time with the lantern between her feet and the document case on her knees. The groan was not audible from inside. From inside, she could only hear the very faint sound of water moving through the lateral pipe at the wall, a low, steady susurration, constant and patient, as it had been constant and patient for 15 years, while the men below argued about whether old iron talked in the cold. It did not settle for her in that moment as a triumph. It settled as a weight, the weight of what those 3 documents represented. 48 people, and 230 acres, and 4 children in a hot summer, and Ruth Calloway writing letters to a county office that answered with a form. She stayed in the drum until she had memorized the layout of what she had found. and then she descended. If a body wants to understand what a system is doing, she had told the board's chairman the morning of her first meeting, they need only look at where the water goes. Pell had nodded as if she had said something he already knew, which she had understood at the time to mean he had not understood it at all. She spent the next morning photographing the valve and the document case in place, using a daguerreotype kit she had purchased second-hand in Cheyenne before leaving for Caswell, because her father had taught her that documentation was the first tool and always the heaviest. She made 2 sets of written transcriptions of the ledger, copying it in full onto paper she bought from Ferris's supply room. She wrapped the original documents in oilskin and placed them in the canvas grip beside the pipe wrench. She left the valve and its case in the drum with the hatch relocked. She went to see Ruth Calloway again that afternoon. She set the transcriptions on Ruth's table without preamble and told her what she had found and where. Ruth looked at the papers with her hands folded in her lap, and she was quiet for a time that Vera did not try to fill. Then Ruth said, in the same dry voice as before, that she would like to see them filed with the county surveyor before the board had any chance to hear of it. Vera agreed. She walked back to the keeper's shed and packed what she needed for a 2-day ride to the county seat at Laramie. She left before light the following morning, the originals in the grip and the transcription copy left in Ruth's keeping. The ride was cold, and the road was poor east of Caswell, and she reached Laramie in the early afternoon of the second day. The county surveyor's office was a small room above the assessor, staffed by a man named Olson who received her with the polite neutrality of a civil servant managing a workload he would not describe as light. He read the documents. He read the ledger transcription and the ace-built drawings and the signed diversion order. He looked at the photographs she'd made of the valve in the drum. He asked her 2 questions, precise and direct, and she answered them with the same precision. Then he set the papers down on his desk and looked at them for a long moment without speaking. He told her that Doyle currently held a renewable water concession from the county for the distribution of supply from 3 additional structures he had built since 1871, that the concession came up for renewal in January, and that the materials she had brought him would prevent that renewal and would initiate a recovery action against the private lateral and the land holdings it had served. He told her that the downstream land that had constituted the cooperative's claim had been tax defaulted and reassigned 3 times since 1879, and that the current holders would need to be addressed through a separate process, but that the county had a mechanism for reviewing land assignments made in consequence of fraudulent infrastructure denial. He asked her whether she wished to be named as the discoverer of record. She said she did. He stamped the document case with the county intake seal and dated it. She rode back to Caswell. The ride back was 2 days through country that was turning from brown to gray as November pressed down from the north. She stopped the first night at a stage relay house east of Laramie, a low building with a supper table and a plank floor, and she sat by the fire after supper with the document case in her lap and read through the ledger again by the light of a tallow candle. 6 years of flow records, volumes in cubic feet per day for the lateral, annotated in a hand she had now spent enough time with to recognize as Doyle's own, careful and slanted, the hand of a man who understood the value of precision in keeping his own accounts. The receipts column ran to totals that, by her rough calculation, represented something in the neighborhood of $1,400 over 6 years, extracted from a water system that the public record showed as serving the cooperative at no profit. $1,400 in the 1870s in Wyoming Territory was enough to purchase a significant parcel of orchard land. It was also, she reflected, almost exactly what it would have cost the cooperative families to keep their subscription payments current for 6 years while receiving nothing in return. She put the ledger away and slept. The board learned of the filing before she returned to Caswell. Ferris told her afterward that Pell had gone very quiet when the news reached him, and that Doyle, who sat on the board as its infrastructure director, had left the meeting early and had not been seen at his office since. She did not ask for more detail than that. The ledger and the diversion order were doing the work that no argument she could have made in any meeting room would have done. Physical evidence did not require her to raise her voice. It required only to exist in the right hands, and she had put it there. The hardware merchant, whose name was Crane, stopped her on the street 2 days after her return and said only that he reckoned now she had earned her keep, and that the latter was better than it had been in any memory he had of it. She thanked him and kept walking. She spoke only one useful thing about the matter in the days that followed. She said it to Ruth Calloway when she returned to the sod house to tell her what Olson had confirmed, standing in the door of that low, dry room with the afternoon sun behind her, and Ruth at the table with her hands still folded in her lap. She said, "The documents were there the whole time. He sealed them in with the valve because he assumed no one who came after would be able to read what they were looking at." Ruth looked at her. She said, "And were they right?" Vera said for a while. The county surveyor's recovery action took 4 months to complete. When it concluded in the spring of 1888, Doyle's water concession was voided. The private lateral was formally decommissioned, its diversion valve locked in the closed position by a county engineer who climbed the tower on a Monday morning in March with Vera accompanying him, and who read the valve's cast markings with professional care before he secured it. The lead seal with Doyle's firm's mark she kept in the document case along with the originals, which Olson's office returned to her once the legal record was established, citing her as the recovering party. The downstream land question resolved more slowly and less completely than the water question, as such things tend to do when land has passed through multiple hands under instruments that are technically legitimate, even when their origins are not. Ruth Calloway was recognized in county records as an injured party of the 1872 diversion fraud, and the assessment on her remaining land was adjusted to reflect the 20 years of subscription payments the cooperative had made without receiving the promised water. It was not full restitution. It was what the existing instruments allowed. Ruth told Vera, when Vera brought her the paperwork confirming the adjusted assessment, that she had not expected full restitution. She had expected to die with the letters she had written still sitting unanswered in some county drawer. She set the paperwork on the table and left her hand on it for a moment, and then she lifted her hand and poured coffee from the pot she kept on the back of her wood stove. She said, "Your father taught you well," Vera said. "He taught me to listen." The lateral valve was sealed and the diversion ended, and the town of Caswell's water tower ran on the original 3 pipes and nothing else, the way it had been designed to run before Doyle climbed it alone in the spring of 1872. The Groaned did not return after that. Without the lateral drawing pressure at night and the friction that drew from the equalizing head, the tank was quiet in the dark. The board's members and the townspeople who had lived beneath the sound for 16 years remarked on the silence as if it were something strange, a new development, rather than the correction of an old theft. Vera stayed on in Caswell through the winter and into the following spring. She kept the maintenance contract and she kept the keeper's shed. She climbed the tower every week to check the float and the valve positions and the condition of the hatch seal. She cleaned the drum in April, after the thaw, removing the residue of 15 years of condensation from its iron walls with a wire brush and a coat of linseed oil. She thought sometimes, standing at the top of the ladder in the wind with the country spread out below her in every direction, about what her father had meant by listening to a system. He had meant it practically, as a technique for diagnosis. She had come to understand it as something else as well, something that resisted the simple naming she usually preferred. He had meant that most things that appear to be settled are not settled. They are only quiet. And the difference between something quiet and something resolved is work. The document case she kept on the windowsill of the keeper's shed, next to the pipe wrench. If you have ever lived near something that made a sound no one could explain, a sound that everyone around you had decided to accept, you understand something of what Vera Lund understood when she climbed that ladder with a lantern and a pry bar and opened what no one had thought to open. If that story stayed with you, leave a word about it below and consider finding another in this same vein. Spring came late to central Wyoming. When it arrived, it brought a long, clear thaw that ran the snowmelt into the Artesian Wells catchment and kept the tower's tank full through April and into May. Vera climbed it on the first morning of genuine warmth, when the air at 60 feet carried the smell of wet sage, and the distant mountains held snow only in their highest creases. She stood at the top of the ladder with one hand on the hatch and looked out across the territory, the town small below her, the road south toward Ruth Calloway's place, a pale thread through the new grass, the country running on in every direction until it met the sky. She went down and opened the keeper's shed and set the pipe wrench in her coat pocket, where it rode against her hip, cracked handle and leather wrap and all, exactly as it had on the day she arrived. The tower above her was quiet,